From the United Nations Office to the African Union, this is She Stands for Peace. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and in this podcast, I speak with thought leaders and peace builders who share their reflections and best practices in achieving the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Africa. Today, I'm joined by Fatima Maiga, founding member and president of the Coalition of Women Leaders of North, South and Central Mali. Fatima Maiga joins me from Bamako, and we have a conversation about advocacy for the protection of women and girls. Fatima Maiga, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. You are a renowned mediator for sustainable and inclusive peace. You have a fantastic proven track record as a policy reformer, advocating for women's rights and empowerment. And you're also president of a coalition of women from the signatory groups of the peace agreement.
Hello, Dr. Yemisi. Thank you so much for this opportunity and thanking your auditors.
I want us to start our conversation by unpacking what we mean by the protection of women and girls, women's rights, because often when we talk about protection in the context of peace and security, it's often used in a victimhood context and to capture a lot of things. So what are your thoughts on how the international women, peace and security community and member states, African member states, interpret the protection of women's rights in the context of the WPS agenda? And I ask this also in the context of your speech that you gave to the Security Council in 2021, when you said that women, peace and security must move from being just everybody's business to being a clearly defined responsibility.
This is a kind of a tricky question, but the simplest way is the most meaningful way to look at the question of WPS, Women, Peace and Security. It's to see it from the point of view of the women who are directly affected. What do they care? What are their priorities? And is the agenda, quote unquote, really serving those priorities? So, I'm in Mali, a country that has known violent conflict for the past 10 years, but with specificity from the time when Resolution Council 1325 was passed 22 years ago. We are in a situation of terrorism and rebellion. The rebellion has sort of stopped with the signing of the peace agreement in 2015, but close to 70% of our territory is still occupied by Islamic terrorists and armed groups. So if you ask the women from Mopti, which is the epicenter of the crisis, it's a central region of Mali where you have the most occupation by terrorist groups. This is where almost 90%, according to MINUSMA, 90% of human rights violations are taking place now in Mali since 2015-16. We have close to 1 million women living under the rule of those Islamic terrorists. When they will look at the 4 or 3 main things of the agenda, higher representation of women might not make sense to them, especially if it means more women as a candidate for elections, for example, because simply when you have all your schools closed, when you can't move, when you are forced to wear a burqa style veil where you experience different types of violence, including sexual violence, then your priority is not about running for elections or even voting because you don't even have the space for that. When we look at the other big pillar of 1325, which is making sure that women participate in negotiations and also that peace agreement really talk about their issues. Well, if I take the case of Mali, it took us 5 years to have women in what we call the monitoring body of the peace agreement. 5 years to just get a few women, let alone taking into account their issues. Their issues are about getting justice, because justice, the lack of justice, the fact that some of the perpetrators of violence are still roaming in those communities, none have been brought before the justice, is one key issue for women. Women also have a problem with the lack of disarmament and conditional disarmament, where what you see, it's one aspect in which the peace agreement has not made a lot of progress, for example, because those who have signed the peace agreement pose so many conditions that we have more arms now than we used to have them in 2012. So yes, I'll stop it here. I believe when I say it should stop, well, I was advocating this during my speech before the Security Council that indeed 1325 was a revolution. It's something that got us to get the ears of the powers to acknowledge that women, beyond victims, women need to be actresses because they have a say in every determinant of conflict. And the way they talk about crisis is probably the way that can bring lasting peace because they really look at the root causes against justice, lack of development, lack of access to resources, etc. etc. So it's good to have made it an issue that's on the table, to have mainstreamed the issue. No one is going to question why women should be there. It's no longer what they used to tell us, pollution, pollution sonore. But at the same time, with the evolution that we're seeing, again, now we're seeing a terrorism where states have been so weakened that even the minimal level of protection that we women activists and right defenders used to be able to get from those states are no longer available. So what we need to have now, it's a recognition of this situation where those states are even more fragilized, where the political agenda of the terrorists is so plain, and that agenda has to do with closing the space of women. What we might need to do is to really have two, three, four things that we put on the table in countries with their specificity, and we say, this is the things we want to move on and we want results. That's what we mean. Responsibility must be fall on very specific people with clear results so that we can move from just saying, yes, we have addressed issues, not just advocate for them.
And what I'm hearing from your response also is the importance of localized agendas around protection of women's rights, right? And then the different categories of women that play in that. So you have women in Mopti, but you also have women like yourself who are peace builders who need a different level of protection as well.
Definitely. Well, as you know, we can simplify. You have those who are living in the first line of those human rights exactions in Mopti and also in the northern part. And you have some of us who are lucky enough to still have the ability to move around. We have our mobility. We still have a certain level of voice. We are able to meet with people at national level because most of the peacekeeping and the negotiation process still takes place in big cities in Bamako. So we have that proximity, and we are able to some level, act to demand that the agenda is not only considered but fulfilled. Yes, but we have a lot of issues, obviously.
And you spoke earlier on about the participation of women in the monitoring committee because you worked with the embassy of Norway as special counselor leading the initiative that led to the increasing of participation of women in the monitoring committee of the Agreement for Peace and Reconciliation in Mali. And as of 2021, the committee has had 9 women members. So protecting the participation of women in peace and security has been a key focus for Norway whilst they've been a member and president of the UN Security Council. So, reflecting on this achievement of having women included in the monitoring committee, what would you say was your biggest takeaway and lesson from how this was achieved? And I asked this also in the context of Mali, as you described it, where you have, for example, the role of religious groups in pressurizing transnational government from enacting the draft law against gender-based violence, where it's a country with very much an active conflict, which makes the agreement itself very fragile, and where the peace agreement itself is suffering from buy-in. So these are examples of structures, institutions, beliefs, and individuals that can form barriers to the inclusion of women in peace and security instruments. So what would you say was your biggest takeaway and lesson from how the inclusion of women in the monitoring committee was achieved?
The takeaway from this very interesting adventure, if I can call it, like women's rights and the promotion of women's rights continue to be the problem of women. It's their affair. It's their responsibility, meaning that they're not at the table. If they don't fight, if they don't push, no one is going to do it for them, regardless of 1325, regardless of CEDAW, regardless of our own national law. When those conflicts happen, there's this belief and this stance that we're in extraordinary situations. So, therefore, women's rights problems are secondary. We can wait, we can wait. And in fact, most of the time, it's actually accepted. Then the status quo, which wasn't even good, becomes sort of like the desired, the expected situation to go back to. But we know the status quo, the way before, wasn't good either. So, coming back to the question, I want to say to acknowledge Norway's stance on the approach Norway took when they asked me to work with them was that, okay, there should be no reason why 5 years down after we've signed this peace agreement, Mali, of all the countries, is still so lacking. Even South Sudan had a better inclusion of women. Central African Republic, most of them had at least a few women in substantive roles. And we had known in the formal process because, I want to make a difference between what I call the formal settings and the informal. Women have always been so active, so decisive in informal processes, for example, going door to doors. When the terrorists came and invaded Timbuktu and Gao in 2013, women are the ones who really came out and say, "Look, listen, we are here." Like what you're saying in Afghanistan, women are very brave in doing those kind of things. But when it comes to decision making at formal settings, here we go, we don't see them anymore. So the way Norway wanted was like, let's bring women, but from their own terms, not sort of broker women's participation from their own men who were 100% members of this committee. So they really entrusted me with a good room for maneuver. So I started working with these women. As you know, I've created this foundation, this coalition, with two objectives. One of them being increasing the representation of women in formal settings. So it was easy for me to connect with them. And they gave me the roadmap. They said, listen, the way we prefer is to pre-select our own, the one we know who is who can make a difference in this body, and so on and so forth. So what we did was to document the process. We put criteria, which, as you know, men never felt they needed to. We still don't know how men came into being members of the CSA, which is the Comité de Suivi de l'Accord. Bona fide, they're men. So, and sometimes they would even joke with us and say, "Well, we're here because we used to have our arms, and you guys didn't have arms, so you don't belong." But anyway, more seriously, we put criteria. For example, why would you want as a woman to come to the committee? Why are you bringing? What is your accountability to other women who might not have that privilege? So after 3 months, we actually interviewed those women. Can you imagine us picking the phone, calling these women in Kidal, in Menaka, in Gao? And in hindsight, some of them told us that it was the first time that they felt they were really valued for their experience. So in the end, 9 women came into the CSA, the monitoring body, after 5 years being absent. And what I want to say, Norway also put the money that enabled these women to join under the same conditions as men. So this is a practical step that really made it possible for women to come on board. And Norway is really to be commended for that. But I also have MINUSMA and other agencies and women themselves also contributed very much to this outcome.
Absolutely. And I can see that that is very much an inclusive approach, and also an approach that perhaps, when we think about a lot of agreements that are lacking in implementation, it's often attributed to a lack of buying or involvement in the first place in the development of the agreement. So would you say these kind of strategies of really understanding the why for each person and making their involvement in committees and agreements very relevant to their personal experiences could also impact the successful implementation of agreements?
Yes, I think there's no question about it. No buy-in, no implementation, and that's why studies show that at least 50% of agreements just fall apart within 5 years of their enactment. Buy-in is necessarily necessary inclusivity, meaning inclusivity of different agenda. The women's agenda are about a disarmament, about development, about access to services and better access, better services than they used to be, because these are the reasons sometimes why peace, is broken, the lack of access and justice. This is so important, and unfortunately, when the last evaluations by the independent evaluation of the implementation of the peace agreement has consistently shown that these issues are the ones for which there's been the least progress, especially the questions of development and the questions of peace and reconciliation and justice, transitional justice. These are consistently been for the past 7 years where the least progress has been made. So, there's there's a link between the lack of inclusivity, the lack of buy-in, and the absence of progress.
And to tackle further what you were saying about access, because access also is broader beyond the access to the agreements, because land and access to land is one of the main issues emerging from the conflict, especially in terms of the access rights of marginalized people, which of course includes women. And these challenges of access led to the enactment of the agricultural land law in 2017. And in a briefing to the Security Council, you yourself highlighted the importance of addressing root causes, kind of like what you just said, that lead to crisis and instability. You highlighted the need for inclusive and equitable governance of land and productive resources and access to justice. So tell us more about the role land and access to land has contributed to the conflict in Mali, especially how it has impacted women and how this led to the enactment of the agricultural land law.
Just like in Cote d'Ivoire, where I served when I was managing UN Women there, and in Mali now, a land access to natural resources has always been identified as a key driver of violent conflict. So, okay, when the law was passed, La Loi du Foncier Agricole, that's the law in French, in 2017, it was the end of a very long process that started even before the crisis began, because there was a recognition that addressing land issues is key in peace settings, and it's key in even more in conflict settings. This specific law provides that at least 15% of land that has been enhanced by public money and money from donors, enhanced to bring irrigation systems, to bring roads, this specific type of land, 15% must be given to women and young people. And it's groundbreaking. In the context of Mali, Mali is one country that has land. We do have land, at least 1 million hectares of land that can be used for agricultural purposes. So, and trust me, many people are aware of this. Chinese investors are coming to buy a lot of land, but somehow women don't have access to land. To be quite honest, men also don't have access to, I would say, secure land. Men have access to land because our culture enabled them to have it. Women don't have access to land, be it secured or not. So when this law was passed in 2017, even though the proportion is small, it's better to go from 0 to 15 than nothing. The fact is, unfortunately, it has almost never been implemented in a documented way. But this is how we go, how our thinking. When women have access to land, especially in times of conflict, where land has become, with also the different pressure of climate change, land has become a key issue, enabling women to have access. It's enabling them to have power, economic power, power to make decisions, power to go to the bank, to get other what we call productive resources, meaning loans, over access that we might not have time to delve into. For us, it's one of those key interventions that takes us from the status quo, that takes us even in a better place than what we used to be before the crisis. And this is what we're advocating with the donor community and also with the government. take the opportunity of the crisis to change the status quo, to say that now more than ever, we need the conflict resolution around natural resources to also tackle issue of inequality, issues of why aren't women allowed to access land. So we look at it as an opportunity. And hopefully, Norway, that has worked so much for women's participation in the monitoring body, will also see it as an intervention that's at the nexus of conflict and development, and that will take away so many girls and women from poverty so that we can even break what I call intergenerational transmission of poverty by helping women access to secure land in Mali.
But you said that there's been a challenge of implementation. So, how would you describe the situation of implementing the law 5 years on?
So it's not only this law that has problems in implementation, I have to say, but in this particular case, 2017, we're still in the middle of the conflict. Well, it's a matter of political will. It's a matter of someone taking leadership. What we know, a lot of bureaucracy has been involved in following up on this law. Like nobody has the data. Nobody really can tell you exactly per year how much has not been given. So I'll just say to resolve this issue, we just need a groundbreaking program that says, listen, as part of the next 2, 3, 5 years, what we're going to do, we will focus on one of those results. You remember what I was saying in the beginning about this whole agenda being the affairs of everybody. This could be one key area where we can look for progress and document and evaluate, for example. That's what it takes. Somebody to say that's going to be one thing on the agenda, and we're going to monitor it so that next year, 2 years from that, we know how much progress we've made. It's just a matter of political will and consensus.
And speaking about political will, several African countries now have national action plans. So, in the context of everything that we've talked about today, what are your reflections of how well African states have done, not just in having national action plans, but also in terms of implementation, particularly on some of the key issues we've discussed today about the impact these have on women and their rights?
If you leave the UN circles and the international circles, very few at stakeholders in Mali know what is the resolution 1325 and even the national action plan, of which Mali has had, like, we're on the fifth, or at least, no, the third or the fourth national action plan on 1325. What does it mean? Mali has been decentralized. We've been in the process of decentralizing for the past 30 years with, ups and downs. But what it means, national plans like we have in Mali is still very much governed at national level. I'm being very, very blunt and honest. The agenda is being set at national level and then broken down in terms of action at decentralized level. This should be changed, maybe. Again, we turn down the pyramid. It becomes the bottom is on the top. The community level should be the one deciding what are the priorities. How do we want to do disarmament? What does disarmament and reintegration means to us? What does it mean to us, justice at this point? So they could do the agenda in Mopti and in Menaka, in Kidal. Those are regions that are primarily affected by the crisis. So it's the whole approach, I believe, in agenda setting should change, in priority setting should change, so that we talk to the council people, we talk to what we call the intermediary authorities that were set up in places in the regions where the crisis hit, and that the elected officials are no longer in place. For example, those are the ones who should hear about the spirit, the idea of Resolution 1325, own it and translate it into their own local development instruments. If we see this, then we can say there's a buy-in and we will see changes. But if we stay at the central level, then it will just become something for certain circles to recycle every year, and we won't see the results that are so much needed in terms of protection, in terms of justice, in terms of return of social basic services.
What is the situation like with media in Mali and the extent to which they're able to play a significant role in that process of, making sure the National Action Plan is something that people are aware of and that is part of their day to day?
Wow, that's a very key question about the role of the media in informing, in participating to attitude and behavior change. Well, on this specific issue, I don't recall having heard any show or anything around the national plan. That doesn't mean that, for example, certain thematics like gender-based violence is not scrutinized, is not mediated. It's really that percent, for example, is an issue that the media has worked a lot on. So I'd say maybe not so much talking about the resolution as a legal instrument, but taking some of the thematics that matter and then build information, shows around it. Yes, definitely they've done it. And actually, you're giving me a good idea to see how we can remobilize certain media. But one thing I have to say now, social media has become so important in the landscape for the goods and the bad aspects. But social media might be also a good place to engage on thematics that are key to national action plans, primarily gender-based violence, sexual violence during conflict, that they have already started, and to a lesser extent, women's political participation, but they will do it during events and not so in a constant manner that we need if we want to see the changes.
Brilliant. So today we've been talking about advocacy for the protection of women and women's rights in conflict settings. So to finish off our conversation, if there was one action you would like our listeners to take today in relation to all that we've discussed, what would that be?
It would be that we're at a crossroads. Somehow, 22 years ago, this resolution was passed because the situation was pretty bad. And the hope was that conflicts would be better dealt with the inclusion of women. Unfortunately, what we're seeing, especially with the rise of terrorism in Mali and other Sahelian region, is that things are getting more complex. So we need people to hear us. For example, we need the kind of solidarity that can change things, that we're not just mere spectators, people, onlookers, but we do act when it matters. We've had two reasons: what happened in Afghanistan and what's happening in Ukraine. When we see so much scrutiny, and to a lesser extent for Afghanistan, to a lot of extent vis-a-vis Ukraine, for example, where we see day to day what's going on, what a conflict can bring, how it can break apart societies, and how we are very much equal from Western or non-Western parts of the world in the face of unconsciousness, in the case of unthinkable acts, right? But when we see the kind of active solidarity by state members from the European Union, for example, and we compare it to what has happened to the Sahel, somebody even, it's a scale of 1 to 100, the difference. So what we need is to remobilize people because we know these issues are not stopping. They will become more complex. But if we manage to garner a active solidarity, and I'm calling on the African Union, these are the ones who I believe are responsible for the continent's security, especially for the protection and the security of our girls and women. Africa has the means and must have the political will to find in itself in its own solution, because we've seen how other regions are able to band together. So that's what I mean. Let's make our girls, our women, part of the future, not only in words, but in deeds. And it matters at local level, it matters at national level, and it matters at continental level. So that's my take. I want this fight to be fought with us, with our own institutions, with women, with the type of inclusivity that our societies know how to put in place. And last thing, I would like to say, when it comes to Mali particularly, come to Mali. It's something that people don't do anymore. This country used to be a beacon of stability before 2012. I want to tell people that the people who made it this stability, who made our empire the greatest empire, as you know, the richest man on earth, Kanko Musa is a Malian. We have Timbuktu. We have such a civilization of peace. We have a culture that's still vibrant. What we need is for people to re-engage with Mali, with Malians. Come to see us. Come and let's fight it again like we used to. And I don't want Mali to be isolated. So that's what I would like to say to those people who are listening to us. And we're here. They can contact us to come and join us.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Fatima Maiga. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Merci, MEC. Kambufu, this is in Bambara to say bye-bye. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to She Stands for Peace, the podcast series where thought leaders and peace builders share their reflections and best practices in the women, peace and security agenda in Africa. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and this podcast was produced by the United Nations Office to the African Union with the generous support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Don't forget to join the conversation using the hashtag She Stands for Peace.